Welcome to Bedtime Express, your peaceful journey into restful sleep and gentle learning. I'm your narrator for tonight's voyage through history, and I'm delighted you've chosen to travel with us. Before you fall asleep, please give us a like and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more peaceful adventures through history, science, and culture. Your support helps us create more content to accompany you on your nightly travels toward rest. Don't forget to write in the comments where you want us to take you on your next journey. Tonight, we're embarking on a 3-hour bedtime story designed specifically for adults who love to learn while they drift towards sleep. As the world settles into the gentle embrace of night, we embark on a journey through time to an era when humanity's spiritual consciousness was awakening in the most profound ways. Between the years 0 and 700 of the Common Era, 4 great rivers of faith began to flow across the ancient world, each carrying with it the hopes, dreams, and deepest longings of countless souls. In this peaceful twilight hour, let us drift back through the centuries to witness the birth and blossoming of Christianity, the expansion of Buddhism, the crystallization of Hinduism, and the emergence of Islam. These were not merely religious movements, but profound transformations of human consciousness that would shape civilizations for millennia to come. Now, settle into your most comfortable position. Let your breathing become slow and natural. Allow yourself to release the tensions of the day as we begin our gentle voyage back through time to witness the dawn of faith across the ancient world. Close your eyes and imagine the world as it was nearly 2,000 years ago. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, its roads connecting distant lands like arteries of stone. In the east, the Silk Road wound through mountain passes and desert oases, carrying not only precious goods, but precious ideas. Great cities hummed with the voices of merchants, scholars, and seekers, while in quiet groves and humble dwellings, teachers shared wisdom that would echo through the ages. This is the story of how faith took root and flourished, how simple messages of love, compassion, and truth spread like seeds on the wind, finding fertile ground in human hearts across the vast tapestry of the ancient world. Let this gentle telling carry you into the realm of dreams, where time flows like honey and the great mysteries of existence unfold in whispered revelations. All aboard the Bedtime Express. Let the journey begin now. The Dawn of Faith, a journey through the rise of major religions. In the small town of Bethlehem, under a canopy of stars that seemed to shine with unusual brightness, a child was born whose teachings would transform the world. The year was approximately 4 BCE, though we mark it now as the beginning of a new era. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, and though he would live only 33 years, his message would spread across continents and through centuries like ripples on an infinite pond. Growing up in the dusty hills of Galilee, Jesus learned the carpenter's trade from his father Joseph, working with his hands to shape wood into useful things. But even as a young man, there was something different about him, a quiet radiance that drew people like moths to a gentle flame. When he began his ministry around the age of 30, walking from village to village along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, his words carried a power that touched the deepest places of the human heart. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," he would say, his voice carrying across the hillsides where crowds gathered to hear him speak. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." These were not the words of conquest or dominion, but of love and humility, revolutionary ideas in a world often ruled by might and fear. The parables he told were like seeds planted in fertile minds. The story of the Good Samaritan, teaching that love knows no boundaries of race or creed. The tale of the prodigal son, showing the infinite mercy of divine forgiveness. The parable of the mustard seed, revealing how the smallest acts of faith can grow into mighty trees of change. Each story was a gem of wisdom, polished smooth by repetition and passed from heart to heart like precious heirlooms. But the world was not ready for such radical love, and the authorities, both Roman and Jewish, saw this gentle teacher as a threat to their established order. In the city of Jerusalem, during the season of Passover, when the city swelled with pilgrims, Jesus was arrested, tried, and sentenced to die upon a cross outside the city walls. The crucifixion was meant to be an end, a final silencing of this voice that spoke of love where others preached law, of mercy where others demanded justice. As his body hung upon that rough wooden cross, darkness seemed to fall upon the world, and his followers scattered like frightened sheep, their hopes dying with their beloved teacher. But death, they would discover, was not the end of the story. 3 days later, according to the accounts that would later be written down as the Gospels, Jesus rose from the dead, appearing first to Mary Magdalene in a garden, her tears of sorrow transformed into tears of joy. The resurrection became the cornerstone of Christian faith, the proof that love is stronger than death, that light can never be permanently extinguished by darkness. After witnessing their risen Lord, the disciples were transformed from fearful followers into bold messengers of hope. Led by Peter, the fisherman who had denied knowing Jesus during the crucifixion but was forgiven and restored, they began to preach the good news throughout Jerusalem and beyond. The early Christian community was a radical experiment in living, where believers held all things in common, sharing their possessions with those in need, and gathering daily to break bread together in memory of their Lord. They called themselves followers of the Way, and their love for one another was so remarkable that observers would say, "See how these Christians love one another." But it was a man named Saul of Tarsus, later known as the Apostle Paul, who would become the great architect of Christianity's expansion beyond its Jewish origins. Initially a fierce persecutor of Christians, Paul experienced a dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, where he claimed to have encountered the risen Christ in a blinding vision that left him temporarily sightless but permanently transformed. Paul's missionary journeys would take him across the Mediterranean world, from the synagogues of Asia Minor to the philosophical forums of Athens, from the bustling ports of Corinth to the imperial capital of Rome itself. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and constantly in danger, but nothing could stop him from proclaiming the message that had captured his heart, that in Christ there was neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for all were one in divine love. As the decades passed, Christian communities began to spring up like flowers after rain throughout the Roman Empire. In Rome itself, believers met in homes and catacombs, their faith sustained by the example of martyrs who faced death with such courage and peace that even their executioners were sometimes moved to conversion. The persecution under emperors like Nero and Diocletian was severe, with Christians thrown to lions in the Colosseum or burned as living torches to light imperial gardens. Yet each act of cruelty seemed only to strengthen the faith of believers and attract new converts who marveled at the power that could enable ordinary people to face death with songs of praise on their lips. In Alexandria, Christian scholars began to develop sophisticated theological systems, wrestling with deep questions about the nature of Christ and the relationship between divine and human. In Antioch, believers first came to be called Christians, taking pride in bearing the name of their Savior. In smaller communities scattered across North Africa, Asia Minor, and Gaul, humble believers lived out their faith in acts of charity and devotion that slowly but surely transformed their societies. The writings of the New Testament began to take shape during these early centuries, as the apostles' letters were copied and circulated among the churches, and the stories of Jesus' life and teachings were carefully preserved in the four Gospels. These texts would become the sacred scriptures of Christianity, alongside the Hebrew Bible that Christians called the Old Testament, forming a complete revelation of God's relationship with humanity. The greatest transformation in Christianity's early history came in the year 312 CE, when the Roman Emperor Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of the cross in the sky before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, 05. According to the account, he heard the words, "In this sign, conquer," and adopted the Christian symbol as his banner. After his victory, Constantine became the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity, fundamentally altering the religion's relationship with political power. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious freedom throughout the empire, ending centuries of Christian persecution and allowing the faith to emerge from the shadows into the full light of imperial favor. Churches that had once met in secret now began to construct magnificent basilicas, and bishops who had once hidden from authorities now found themselves advisors to the emperor himself. This dramatic change brought both blessings and challenges to the Christian community. On one hand, the faith could now spread freely, and vast resources became available for building churches, copying scriptures, and supporting missionary work. On the other hand, the close relationship with imperial power raised new questions about the proper relationship between church and state, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world. Constantine himself, though he supported Christianity and was eventually baptized on his deathbed, continued to exercise authority over church affairs, calling the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to address disputes about the nature of Christ. This council produced the Nicene Creed, which became the foundational statement of Christian belief about the Trinity and the divine nature of Jesus Christ. As Christianity spread and matured during these first 4 centuries, great theologians emerged to articulate the faith's core beliefs and address the intellectual challenges posed by Greek philosophy and competing religions. Figures like Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen began to show how Christian faith could engage with the highest forms of classical learning, demonstrating that the gospel was not only for the simple and unlearned, but could satisfy the deepest intellectual longings of humanity. The question of Christ's nature proved particularly challenging and important. If Jesus was truly divine, how could he also be truly human? If he was truly human, in what sense was he divine? These questions led to intense theological debates that would continue for centuries, ultimately resulting in the great Christological formulations of later councils. Another crucial development was the emergence of Christian monasticism, beginning with figures like Anthony of Egypt, who retreated to the desert to pursue a life of prayer, fasting, and contemplation. These desert fathers and mothers became living examples of the gospel's call to radical discipleship, their simple lifestyle and evident holiness attracting pilgrims from across the Christian world. The monastic movement would eventually produce some of Christianity's greatest saints and scholars, including Basil the Great, John Chrysostom, and Jerome, who would translate the Bible into Latin, creating the Vulgate version that would serve the Western Church for over a millennium. These monasteries also became centers of learning and charity, preserving classical texts and serving the poor in ways that demonstrated the practical implications of Christian love. By the year 400 CE, Christianity had been transformed from a small Jewish sect into a worldwide religion, with millions of adherents, sophisticated theology, magnificent architecture, and significant political influence. Yet at its heart remained the simple message that had first been proclaimed in Galilee, that God is love, that this love was revealed supremely in Jesus Christ, and that all who believe in him might have eternal life. The seeds planted in that small Palestinian province had indeed become a mighty tree, its branches spreading across the known world and offering shelter to all who sought the shade of divine mercy. As the Roman Empire itself began to face new challenges from barbarian invasions and internal decay, Christianity would prove to be one of the few institutions strong enough to survive and indeed flourish in the changing world that was to come. While Christianity was taking root in the Western world, in the Indian subcontinent, an even more ancient spiritual tradition was undergoing its own profound transformation. Hinduism, that vast ocean of beliefs and practices stretching back thousands of years, was entering what scholars would later call its classical period, a time when the diverse streams of Vedic religion, folk beliefs, and philosophical speculation would flow together into recognizable forms that continue to nourish millions of souls today. Unlike Christianity or Islam, Hinduism had no single founder, no moment of revelation that could be pinpointed in time. Instead, it evolved like a great river system, fed by countless tributaries of wisdom, each contributing its own unique perspective to the ever-deepening flow of spiritual understanding. The Vedas, those ancient hymns and rituals dating back to 1500 BCE, provided the foundational currents, but by the Common Era, new streams of devotion, philosophy, and practice were adding their voices to the eternal song of Dharma. In this gentle twilight of our imagination, let us drift along the sacred rivers of India, where pilgrims have walked for millennia seeking liberation from the wheel of birth and death. Here, in ashrams hidden in forest groves and temples rising like mountains toward the sky, sages contemplated the ultimate nature of reality, while devotees offered their hearts in surrender to the divine. During the early centuries of the Common Era, two great epic poems reached their final forms, carrying within their vast narratives the essence of Hindu Dharma and devotion. The Mahabharata, that colossal work containing over 100 verses, told the story of a great war between cousins, but embedded within its martial tales were profound teachings about duty, righteousness, and the complex moral choices that face every human soul. At the heart of the Mahabharata lay the Bhagavad Gita, perhaps the most beloved and influential text in all of Hindu literature. In this sublime dialogue between the warrior prince Arjuna and his charioteer Krishna, who reveals himself to be the Supreme Lord in human form, the deepest questions of existence are explored with poetic beauty and philosophical depth. Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds, Krishna declares in one of his most famous speeches, revealing his cosmic form to the awestruck Arjuna. Yet, this terrifying vision of divine power is balanced by teachings of infinite love and compassion, showing how the same ultimate reality can be both destroyer and preserver, both terrible and beautiful beyond all imagination. The Gita's teaching of karma yoga, the path of selfless action, would become one of Hinduism's most influential contributions to world spirituality. You have a right to perform your prescribed duties, but you are not entitled to the fruits of your actions, Krishna teaches. Never consider yourself to be the cause of the results of your activities, nor be attached to inaction. This wisdom offered a way to live fully in the world while remaining spiritually free, a teaching that resonated far beyond India's borders. The Ramayana, slightly shorter but no less beloved, told the story of Prince Rama, his devoted wife Sita, and his faithful brother Lakshmana as they faced exile, kidnapping, and war with the demon king Ravana of Lanka. More than an adventure story, the Ramayana was a meditation on ideal relationships, perfect duty, and the triumph of good over evil. Rama himself became the embodiment of Dharma, the righteous king who sacrificed personal happiness for the welfare of his subjects. Sita represented the ideal of feminine virtue and devotion, while Hanuman, the monkey deity who served Rama with unwavering loyalty, became one of Hinduism's most beloved figures, symbolizing the power of pure devotion to overcome any obstacle. These epics were not merely read, but lived, their stories enacted in countless performances, their characters serving as role models for how to navigate the complex challenges of human existence. In every village and palace, people found in these ancient tales guidance for their own spiritual journeys, inspiration for their own struggles between duty and desire, righteousness and self-interest. As the centuries passed, a profound transformation began to sweep through Hindu practice, as the somewhat austere rituals of the Vedic period gave way to warmer, more personal forms of devotion known as bhakti. This wasn't a rejection of earlier traditions, but rather their fulfillment, as the abstract principles of Dharma found expression in intimate, loving relationships with personal deities. In the Tamil lands of South India, poet-saints called the Alvars composed hymns of ecstatic devotion to Vishnu that still bring tears to the eyes of listeners centuries later. Their contemporary Nayanars sang with equal passion to Shiva, describing their love for the Lord in language so intense and personal that it sometimes shocked more conventional religious sensibilities. "O Lord of the burning ground," sang one Nayanar saint, "you dance among the skulls while I dance with joy at the thought of your beautiful form. Take this heart of mine and make it yours, for I have no use for it apart from your service." Such was the intensity of devotion that characterized this bhakti movement, where the soul's longing for God was expressed with all the passion of human love. The great philosopher Saint Shankara, who lived in the 8th century CE, would later systematize much of Hindu philosophy into the non-dualistic system known as Advaita Vedanta. But even his rigorous intellectual approach was tempered by devotional hymns of stunning beauty, showing how the highest philosophical understanding naturally flowers into love. "Forgive me, O Lord, for these 3 sins," he wrote in one famous hymn. "I came on pilgrimage to your temple when you are present everywhere. I engaged in prayer and meditation when you are beyond all thought, and I brought offerings when you are the very self of the universe and need nothing." Such humility and wisdom marked the mature expression of Hindu spirituality during this classical period. Alongside the devotional movements, more esoteric traditions were also developing, collectively known as Tantra. Unlike the renunciatory tendencies of some earlier spirituality, Tantra sought to transform rather than transcend the material world, seeing the physical universe as a manifestation of divine energy rather than an obstacle to spiritual realization. Tantric practitioners develop sophisticated methods of yoga, meditation, and ritual that engaged all aspects of human experience, body, mind, emotion, and spirit in the quest for liberation. They recognized the divine feminine principle, Shakti, as the active, creative power of the universe, often portrayed as the consort and equal partner of the masculine principle of pure consciousness, Shiva. These teachings, often transmitted in symbolic language from teacher to student in initiatory traditions, recognized that the same energies that bind the soul to worldly existence could, when properly understood and channeled, become the very means of liberation. What is poison to the ordinary person becomes nectar to the realized sage, taught one tantric master, expressing this profound reversal of conventional understanding. The great temples of South India, with their towering gopurams reaching toward the sky, and their inner sanctuaries housing sacred images of the deities, became physical embodiments of tantric cosmology. Every aspect of these temple complexes was designed according to sacred geometry, creating spaces where the divine and human realms could meet and interact. In these temples, elaborate rituals were performed daily, treating the deity as a living presence to be awakened, bathed, dressed, fed, and entertained. Devotees would come to have darshan, literally seeing the deity, understanding that, in the exchange of glances between worshipper and divine image, a transmission of grace could occur that transformed consciousness. One of Hinduism's greatest strengths during this classical period was its remarkable ability to incorporate and synthesize diverse religious and philosophical traditions without losing its essential character. Local folk deities were gradually recognized as manifestations of the great gods. Tribal rituals were refined, and incorporated into temple worship. Philosophical insights from various schools were woven together into increasingly sophisticated theological systems. The concept of avatar, divine incarnation, became central to Hindu understanding during this period. Vishnu was said to take form whenever Dharma declined and evil threatened to overwhelm the world, appearing as fish, turtle, boar, man-lion, dwarf, warrior, prince, and ultimately as Krishna, the supreme incarnation who combined divine transcendence with human accessibility. This teaching of avatars allowed Hinduism to remain relevant to changing times and circumstances while maintaining continuity with ancient traditions. New spiritual leaders could be understood as partial incarnations or empowered beings. New insights could be integrated as fresh revelations of eternal truths. New practices could be adopted as appropriate means for new times. The goddess traditions also flourished during this period, as the feminine aspect of divinity was recognized in forms ranging from the gentle and nurturing to the fierce and transformative. Durga, the warrior goddess who defeated the buffalo demon, represented the power of Dharma to overcome evil. Kali, dancing on Shiva's chest, symbolized time and change as divine principles. Saraswati, goddess of learning and arts, embodied the creative power of consciousness itself. The classical period also saw the full development of the Varna and Ashrama systems, which provided social and spiritual frameworks for organizing human life. The four Varnas, Brahmins, priests and teachers, Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, Vaishyas, merchants and farmers, and Shudras, laborers and service providers, were understood as natural divisions of society based on temperament and function rather than rigid castes based purely on birth. The four ashramas or life stages provided a spiritual framework for individual development. Brahmacharya, student, Grihastha, householder, Vanaprastha, forest dweller, and Sannyasa, renunciant. This system recognized that different stages of life called for different emphases and practices, allowing for both worldly engagement and spiritual realization within a single lifetime. During the Grihastha stage, householders were encouraged to pursue the four goals of human life: Dharma, righteousness; Artha, prosperity; Kama, pleasure; and Moksha, liberation. This balance between spiritual and material concerns reflected Hinduism's essential practicality, its recognition that most people need to fulfill their worldly responsibilities while gradually preparing for ultimate spiritual realization. The great law books of this period, such as the Manusmriti and the Arthashastra, attempted to codify these ideals into practical guidelines for social organization and individual conduct. While some of these texts reflected the prejudices of their times and would later be criticized for perpetuating social inequalities, their fundamental intention was to create a society where every person could pursue their spiritual evolution according to their capacity and circumstances. By the end of the classical period, Hinduism had achieved a remarkable synthesis of intellectual sophistication and devotional intensity. The six orthodox schools of philosophy, Samkhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, and Vedanta, provided rigorous frameworks for understanding the nature of reality, consciousness, and liberation, while the devotional traditions offered accessible means for ordinary people to experience divine grace and transformation. This synthesis is perhaps best exemplified in the Puranas, those vast collections of stories, hymns, and teachings that made the abstract principles of the Vedas accessible to all levels of society. Through tales of gods and heroes, demons and sages, the Puranas conveyed profound spiritual truths in forms that could be understood and appreciated by scholars and peasants alike. The Bhagavata Purana, with its detailed account of Krishna's life from birth to departure, became particularly beloved for its combination of philosophical depth and devotional sweetness. The stories of Krishna's childhood pranks, his romantic play with the cowherd girls of Vrindavan, and his ultimate departure from the world became metaphors for the soul's relationship with the divine, playful, intimate, sometimes heartbreaking, but ultimately transformative. As this golden age of classical Hinduism reached its peak around 700 CE, it had established the essential forms and patterns that would continue to shape Indian spirituality for centuries to come. Like a great tree whose roots reached deep into ancient soil while its branches spread wide to shelter countless species of life, Hinduism had become a complete ecosystem of spiritual possibility, offering paths and practices suitable for every temperament and stage of development. In temples and ashrams, in royal courts and humble villages, in the meditation of forest hermits, and the devotional songs of traveling minstrels, the eternal Dharma continued to unfold, revealing ever new facets of the one unchanging truth that underlies all existence. As pilgrims still sing today while bathing in the sacred Ganges, truth is one, but the sages call it by many names. In the soft moonlight of history, we turn our gaze to the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, whose message of liberation through understanding had, by the beginning of the Common Era, already been spreading across India for 5 centuries. But the period from 0 to 700 CE would witness Buddhism's greatest expansion, as the middle path crossed mountain ranges and deserts, sailed across vast oceans, and found new expression in cultures far from its birthplace in the Gangetic plains. The Buddha himself had passed into final nirvana around 480 BCE, leaving behind not a deity to be worshipped, but a method to be practiced, not a creed to be believed, but a path to be walked. His final words, according to tradition, were, "Work out your salvation with diligence," and his followers took this charge seriously, developing increasingly sophisticated understandings of his teaching while adapting it to new environments and circumstances. As we drift through this chapter of our bedtime journey, imagine the gentle sound of monastery bells echoing across misty valleys, the soft rustle of saffron robes as monks walk in meditation, the whispered recitation of sutras in languages the Buddha himself never knew. This is the story of how a teaching born in one small corner of India became a light for the world, illuminating minds and hearts from the steppes of Central Asia to the islands of Japan. By the beginning of the Common Era, Buddhism had already undergone its first major division, splitting into what scholars call the Theravada, Way of the Elders, and Mahayana, Great Vehicle traditions. This wasn't merely a political dispute, but reflected different understandings of the Buddha's ultimate message and the goal of spiritual practice. The Theravada school, which would eventually establish itself firmly in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, maintained that the Buddha was a supremely awakened human teacher, whose example showed others the way to individual liberation. Their ideal was the Arhat, the enlightened individual who had extinguished all mental defilements and achieved freedom from the cycle of rebirth through personal effort and understanding. The Mahayana tradition, however, developed a more expansive vision that would prove extraordinarily influential throughout East Asia. They taught that the Buddha was not merely a human teacher, but a cosmic principle of awakened consciousness that manifested in countless forms across time and space. More radically, they proclaimed that the highest spiritual ideal was not individual liberation, but the Bodhisattva path, the commitment to postpone one's own final enlightenment until all beings could be saved. This Bodhisattva ideal represented a profound shift in Buddhist thought, transforming what had been primarily an individual quest for liberation into a cosmic mission of universal compassion. The Bodhisattva was portrayed as one who, having glimpsed the shore of nirvana, turns back to help others across the turbulent waters of samsara, motivated by boundless love for all sentient beings. The early centuries of the Common Era witnessed an extraordinary flowering of Mahayana literature, as new sutras appeared that claimed to record previously hidden teachings of the Buddha. These texts, written in Sanskrit rather than the Pali of the earlier scriptures, displayed a mythic imagination and philosophical sophistication that pushed Buddhist thought in revolutionary directions. The Lotus Sutra, which would become central to Buddhism in China and Japan, taught that the Buddha's earthly life was merely a skillful means to teach beings at their level of understanding. In reality, it proclaimed, the Buddha had been enlightened from the beginningless beginning and would continue teaching until the endless end, manifesting in whatever forms were necessary to guide beings to awakening. In all the Buddha lands of the 10 directions, the sutra declared in language of stunning beauty, there is only one vehicle of liberation, though it appears in countless forms. As a father might use different toys to coax his children from a burning house, so the Buddha employs various teachings to lead beings from the fire of suffering. This metaphor of skillful means would become central to Mahayana understanding, explaining how seemingly contradictory teachings could all be authentic expressions of Buddha wisdom. The perfection of wisdom literature, culminating in texts like the Heart Sutra and Diamond Sutra, explored the radical implications of the doctrine of emptiness. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, declared the Heart Sutra in perhaps the most famous phrase in all of Buddhism. This didn't mean that phenomena didn't exist, but rather that they had no fixed, independent essence. They arose through interdependence and were empty of the solid reality that ordinary perception attributes to them. This teaching of emptiness was profoundly liberating because it showed that suffering, like all phenomena, was also empty of ultimate reality. Once one truly understood the interdependent nature of existence, attachment and aversion would naturally dissolve, leaving behind the natural compassion and wisdom that were the mind's true nature. As Buddhism developed during this period, various philosophical schools emerged to systematize and interpret the growing body of teachings. The Madhyamaka, or Middle Way school, founded by the brilliant philosopher Nagarjuna around 150 CE, developed sophisticated, logical arguments to demonstrate the emptiness of all phenomena while avoiding the extremes of nihilism and eternalism. Nagarjuna's genius lay in showing how conventional truth and ultimate truth could coexist without contradiction. From the conventional perspective, phenomena exist and function according to cause and effect. From the ultimate perspective, they are empty of inherent existence and arise only through interdependence. Both perspectives were valid and necessary, like two sides of a single coin. The Yogacara school, developed by thinkers like Asanga and Vasubandhu in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, focused on the analysis of consciousness and developed sophisticated understandings of perception, memory, and mental formation. They taught that what we experience as the external world is actually a projection of consciousness itself, stored and shaped by karmic seeds accumulated over countless lifetimes. This consciousness-only philosophy didn't deny the reality of the phenomenal world, but explained it as the creative activity of mind itself, like dreams that seem real while we're dreaming them. Liberation came through recognizing the mind's true nature and purifying it of the karmic seeds that perpetuate the cycle of suffering and rebirth. These philosophical developments weren't merely abstract speculations, but practical tools for meditation and liberation. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning where monks engaged in rigorous debate and contemplation, using logical analysis to cut through the illusions that bind the mind to suffering. As Buddhist philosophy matured in India, the religion began its epical journey across the mountains and deserts of Central Asia along the legendary Silk Road. This network of trade routes that connected China with the Mediterranean wasn't just a highway for silk and spices, but a conduit for ideas, art, and spiritual teachings that would transform entire civilizations. Buddhist merchants and missionaries traveled with the caravans, establishing monasteries and stupas at oasis towns like Kashgar, Khotan, and Dunhuang. These way stations became beacons of learning and refuge, where travelers could find not only physical shelter, but spiritual guidance for their journeys both outer and inner. The caves of Dunhuang, carved into cliffsides at the edge of the Gobi Desert, became repositories of Buddhist art and literature that preserved teachings in languages and scripts that would otherwise have been lost to time. Here, monks copied sutras by candlelight, their patient labor ensuring that the Buddha's words would survive even when the monasteries themselves crumbled into dust. In these borderlands between India and China, Buddhism encountered shamanistic traditions, Zoroastrian influences, and Greek artistic styles left behind by Alexander's conquests. Rather than rejecting these foreign elements, Buddhism demonstrated its characteristic adaptability, incorporating useful techniques while maintaining the integrity of its core message. The great monasteries of Central Asia, like those at Bamiyan in Afghanistan, became centers of learning that rivaled the universities of India. Here, monks from many nations studied together, translating texts, debating philosophy, and developing new forms of artistic expression that would carry Buddhist themes into previously unimaginable cultural contexts. The arrival of Buddhism in China during the Han Dynasty represented one of history's greatest encounters between civilizations. Here was a religion born in India's spiritual ferment, meeting a culture that had been shaped for millennia by Confucian ethics, Taoist mysticism, and indigenous folk beliefs. The result was a creative synthesis that would produce some of Buddhism's most distinctive and influential forms. Initially, Chinese intellectuals understood Buddhism through Taoist concepts, seeing nirvana as similar to the Taoist ideal of wu-wei, non-action, and interpreting Buddhist emptiness through the lens of Taoist teachings about the void. This wasn't a distortion but a necessary bridge that allowed Buddhist ideas to take root in Chinese soil. The great translator Kumarajiva, who arrived in the Chinese capital of Chang'an in 401 CE, revolutionized Chinese Buddhism by providing more accurate translations of key Mahayana texts. His translation of the Lotus Sutra became the foundation for several major Chinese Buddhist schools, while his rendering of Nagarjuna's works introduced Chinese thinkers to the sophisticated philosophy of the Middle Way. But perhaps the most distinctively Chinese development was the emergence of Chan Buddhism, which would later travel to Japan as Zen. Chan masters like Bodhidharma, who legendarily arrived from India in the 6th century, emphasized direct pointing to the mind's true nature rather than gradual study and practice. A special transmission outside the scriptures, the Chan masters proclaimed, not dependent on words and letters, pointing directly to the human mind, seeing into one's true nature and attaining Buddhahood. This radical approach appealed to the Chinese preference for practical wisdom over elaborate philosophy, producing a form of Buddhism that was both deeply Chinese and authentically Buddhist. The story of Huineng, the 6th patriarch of Chan, illustrates this distinctive approach. An illiterate woodcutter who achieved sudden enlightenment upon hearing a single line from the Diamond Sutra, Huineng demonstrated that awakening was not the monopoly of learned monks, but was available to anyone with sufficient clarity and determination. The Tang dynasty, 618–907 CE, represented the golden age of Chinese Buddhism, when the religion enjoyed imperial patronage and produced some of its greatest masters and works of art. The famous pilgrim Xuanzang traveled to India during this period, bringing back hundreds of texts and first-hand accounts of the sacred sites associated with the Buddha's life. Xuanzang's journey, immortalized in the classic novel Journey to the West, captured the Chinese imagination and demonstrated the lengths to which sincere seekers would go to obtain authentic teachings. His translations and commentaries helped establish several major schools of Chinese Buddhism and provided Chinese Buddhists with a more complete understanding of their religion's Indian origins. The great temples of Chang'an and Luoyang during the Tang period rivaled anything in India for their magnificence and scholarly activity. The Famen Temple, with its underground palace containing relics of the Buddha, became a pilgrimage destination that attracted believers from across East Asia. These temples weren't just religious centers, but cultural institutions that preserved literature, supported the arts, and provided social services to the surrounding communities. Chinese Buddhist art during this period achieved heights of beauty and spiritual expression that have rarely been equaled. The cave temples at Longmen and Yonggang, with their thousands of Buddha images carved into living rock, created environments where the faithful could experience the presence of awakened consciousness made manifest in stone. From China, Buddhism made its way across the Korea Strait to Japan, where it would undergo yet another cultural transformation. Arriving officially in 552 CE, when the Korean kingdom of Baekje sent Buddhist texts and images to the Japanese emperor, Buddhism initially faced resistance from those who saw it as a threat to indigenous Shinto traditions. However, the Soga clan's patronage of Buddhism, combined with the religion's obvious cultural sophistication, gradually won over the Japanese elite. Prince Shotoku, regent of Japan in the early 7th century, became Buddhism's great champion, writing commentaries on Buddhist sutras and establishing temples that became centers of learning and artistic achievement. The construction of Todaiji Temple in Nara, with its enormous bronze Buddha statue, demonstrated the Japanese commitment to their new faith. This colossal figure, requiring the resources of the entire nation to create, symbolized both the grandeur of Buddhist cosmology and Japan's determination to establish itself as a major Buddhist civilization. Japanese Buddhism developed its own distinctive characteristics, blending seamlessly with Shinto beliefs in a synthesis that saw kami, Shinto deities, as local manifestations of Buddhist Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. This harmonious coexistence reflected the Japanese genius for cultural adaptation, preserving indigenous traditions while fully embracing foreign innovations. The Tendai and Shingon schools, established by the monks Saicho and Kukai respectively in the early 9th century, brought esoteric Buddhist practices to Japan that emphasized the possibility of achieving enlightenment in a single lifetime through specialized meditation techniques and ritual practices. These schools taught that the phenomenal world itself was the Buddha's body, and that awakening could be found through proper understanding of sacred symbols, sounds, and gestures. While Buddhism was transforming as it moved north and east from India, it was also establishing deep roots in the southern regions of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Here, the Theravada tradition that had preserved the Buddha's teachings in the Pali language found cultures that would embrace and preserve them with remarkable fidelity. Sri Lanka became the great stronghold of Theravada Buddhism, where the complete Pali canon was first committed to writing in the Unnist century BCE. The great monasteries of Anuradhapura and later Polonnaruwa became centers of learning that attracted monks from across the Buddhist world, ensuring the preservation of the earliest recorded teachings of the Buddha. From Sri Lanka, Theravada Buddhism spread to Burma, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, where it became so thoroughly integrated into the culture that these nations are still considered Buddhist countries today. The magnificent temples of Pagan in Burma, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and Sukhothai in Thailand bear witness to the profound impact of Buddhism on these societies. In these Theravada countries, Buddhism became not just a religion, but a complete way of life that shaped everything from royal ceremonies to village festivals. The Sangha, monastic community, became one of the most respected institutions in society, with nearly every young man expected to spend at least some time as a monk, learning meditation and studying the Dharma. The practice of vipassana, or insight meditation, emphasizing direct observation of the arising and passing away of mental and physical phenomena, became highly developed in these traditions. This methodical investigation of experience allowed practitioners to see for themselves the three characteristics of existence that the Buddha had identified: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. Throughout its expansion across Asia, Buddhism demonstrated remarkable skill in adapting to local religious traditions without losing its essential character. Rather than demanding the complete abandonment of indigenous beliefs, Buddhism typically incorporated them into its own cosmology, often explaining local deities as protectors of the Dharma or as beings who had achieved various levels of spiritual attainment. In China, Buddhist temples often included shrines to Taoist immortals and Confucian sages, while in Japan, Buddhist and Shinto deities were worshipped side by side. In Southeast Asia, Hindu deities like Ganesha and Vishnu found places in Buddhist temples, while local spirits and ancestors continued to be honored alongside the Buddha and Bodhisattvas. This synthetic approach reflected Buddhism's fundamental teaching of skillful means, the understanding that different beings required different approaches to spiritual development. What mattered was not doctrinal purity, but practical effectiveness in reducing suffering and promoting wisdom and compassion. The result was a rich tapestry of Buddhist expression that varied dramatically from culture to culture, while maintaining recognizable common elements, whether in the austere meditation halls of Theravada monasteries, the elaborate rituals of esoteric temples, or the sudden shouts of Chan masters. The same fundamental insights about the nature of mind and reality continued to liberate beings from the bondage of ignorance and suffering. Paradoxically, as Buddhism flourished across Asia, it began to decline in the land of its birth. By 700 CE, the great monastic universities of India were facing increasing pressure from a resurgent Hinduism that had absorbed many Buddhist insights while maintaining its own distinctive character. The rise of devotional Hinduism, with its emphasis on personal relationships with God through love and surrender, offered many of the same spiritual satisfactions as Mahayana Buddhism, but within a more familiar cultural context. Hindu philosophers like Shankara developed sophisticated, non-dualistic teachings that paralleled Buddhist emptiness doctrine while remaining rooted in Vedantic tradition. Additionally, Buddhism's emphasis on monastic life began to seem less relevant as Hindu society developed pathways for householders to achieve spiritual realization without abandoning their social responsibilities. The ideal of the Bodhisattva, while inspiring, sometimes seemed abstract compared to the vivid personalities of Hindu gods and goddesses who were portrayed as accessible and responsive to their devotees' needs. Yet Buddhism's impact on Indian culture had been so profound that many of its insights became permanently integrated into the broader Hindu tradition. The emphasis on non-violence, the development of meditation techniques, the understanding of karma and rebirth, and the ideal of universal compassion all became part of the common spiritual vocabulary of the subcontinent. As our gentle journey through Buddhism's expansion draws to a close, we can see how the Buddha's simple message of liberation through understanding had become a vast river of wisdom flowing across the Asian continent. Like sunlight refracting through different prisms, the one Dharma had manifested in countless forms while retaining its essential luminosity. From the rigorous analytical meditation of Theravada monks to the sudden enlightenment experiences of Chan masters, from the elaborate rituals of esoteric schools to the simple devotion of Pure Land practitioners, Buddhism had proven itself capable of speaking to every level of human spiritual need and capacity. The period from 0 to 700 CE had established Buddhism as one of the world's great civilizing forces, not through conquest or coercion, but through the gentle power of wisdom and compassion. In countless temples and monasteries, in the daily lives of millions of believers, in works of art and literature that still inspire today, the Buddha's promise continued to be fulfilled, that suffering could be understood, that liberation was possible, and that all beings possessed the potential for awakening. As we prepare to continue our nocturnal journey through the rise of the world's great faiths, let the image of the Dharma wheel remain in your mind's eye, that ancient symbol of the Buddha's teaching, forever turning, forever carrying beings from the darkness of ignorance toward the light of understanding. In this eternal revolution lies the promise that no being need remain forever trapped in suffering, that wisdom and compassion are the birthright of all conscious creatures. In the hushed hours before dawn, when the desert air carries whispers of eternity, we arrive at one of history's most pivotal moments. The year was 610 CE, and in a cave on Mount Hira, overlooking the trading city of Mecca, a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah was engaged in his customary spiritual retreat, seeking meaning and truth in a world that seemed to have lost its way. Muhammad had long been troubled by the spiritual condition of his people. The Arabian Peninsula was dominated by tribal loyalties and polytheistic practices, where the wealthy exploited the poor, and the sacred Kaaba in Mecca had become cluttered with hundreds of idols representing different tribal deities. Known among his people as Al-Amin, the trustworthy one for his honesty in business and purity of character, Muhammad had developed a practice of withdrawing regularly to the mountains for contemplation and prayer. On this particular night, which would later be called Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power, something extraordinary occurred. According to Islamic tradition, the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad with a command that would change the course of human history. Iqra, "Read." But Muhammad, who could neither read nor write, replied in confusion, "I cannot read." 3 times the angel repeated the command, each time embracing Muhammad until he could barely breathe, until finally the words came, "Read in the name of your Lord who created humanity from a clinging clot. Read, for your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen, taught humanity what it did not know." These were the first verses of what would become the Quran, the final revelation that Muslims believe completed the series of divine messages sent through prophets like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Trembling and fearful, Muhammad rushed home to his beloved wife Khadija, who comforted him and became the first person to accept his prophetic mission. For the next 13 years, Muhammad received revelations that called the people of Mecca to abandon their idols and submit to Allah, the one God who had created and sustained all existence. The message was revolutionary in its simplicity and radicalism. There was no God but Allah. Muhammad was his messenger, and all human beings were equal before their Creator, regardless of tribe, wealth, or social status. "O humanity," proclaimed one early revelation, "we created you from a male and female, and made you into nations and tribes so that you might know one another. The most honored among you in the sight of Allah are the most righteous." This teaching struck at the very foundation of Arabian society, which was built on tribal superiority and hereditary privilege. The early Muslim community that gathered around Muhammad was small and faced fierce persecution from the Meccan establishment, who saw this new monotheistic religion as a threat to their political power and economic interests. The Kaaba, after all, was not just a religious shrine, but a pilgrimage destination that brought considerable wealth to the city through trade and offerings to the various tribal idols housed there. Many of the first converts were among society's most vulnerable, slaves like Bilal, who would later become Islam's first muezzin, women like Khadija, who found in Islam a message of spiritual equality, and young people like Ali, Muhammad's cousin, who were drawn to the revolutionary idealism of the new faith. Their sufferings under persecution became part of Islam's foundational narrative, demonstrating that truth often faces resistance from those who benefit from existing power structures. The revelations received during this Meccan period emphasized the fundamental themes that would characterize Islam throughout its history: the absolute unity and sovereignty of Allah, the reality of divine judgment, the importance of social justice, and the need for personal submission to God's will. These teachings were preserved first in the memories of the faithful, who would recite them in their daily prayers and gather to hear Muhammad recite new revelations as they came. During this difficult period, Muhammad experienced what Islamic tradition calls the Isra and Miraj, the night journey and ascension, which became one of the most beloved episodes in Islamic spirituality. According to the accounts, Muhammad was transported in a single night from Mecca to Jerusalem, where he led all the previous prophets in prayer at the site of the ancient temple, symbolizing Islam's connection to and completion of the earlier Abrahamic traditions. From Jerusalem, he was taken up through the seven heavens, meeting with prophets like Moses, Jesus, and Abraham, and ultimately experiencing the direct presence of Allah. During this mystical journey, the 5 daily prayers were established as one of Islam's fundamental practices, originally 50, but reduced to 5 at Moses' suggestion that this would be more manageable for Muhammad's community. This miraculous journey, whether understood literally or symbolically, became central to Islamic spirituality as a demonstration that the human soul could transcend all limitations and experience direct communion with the divine. It also established Jerusalem as Islam's 3rd holiest city, after Mecca and Medina, creating connections that would have profound historical implications. By 622 CE, persecution in Mecca had become so severe that Muhammad received a divine command to emigrate with his followers to the city of Yathrib, later renamed Medina, the city of the Prophet. This migration, called the Hijra, marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar and represents one of history's most significant turning points. In Medina, Islam was transformed from a persecuted religious minority into a complete social and political system. Muhammad became not just a spiritual leader, but a political ruler, judge, and military commander, demonstrating Islam's teaching that religion should govern all aspects of human life, rather than being confined to private belief. The Constitution of Medina, one of history's earliest written constitutions, established principles of religious tolerance, collective defense, and social justice that would influence Islamic political theory for centuries. It recognized Jews and Christians as people of the book who could practice their religions freely while participating in the broader community's political and economic life. The revelations received during the Medinan period addressed practical questions of governance, law, family relations, and warfare, providing the foundation for Islamic jurisprudence and social organization. These included detailed guidance on matters ranging from commercial contracts to marriage and divorce, from criminal justice to the conduct of war, creating a comprehensive blueprint for Islamic civilization. During this period, the fundamental practices of Islam, known as the 5 pillars, were fully established as the framework for Muslim spiritual life. These weren't burdensome obligations, but joyful expressions of submission to Allah and solidarity with the global Muslim community. The Shahada, the declaration of faith, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, remained the simple but profound statement that defined Islamic belief. To recite these words with sincere conviction was sufficient to enter the Islamic community, regardless of one's previous background or status. Salah, the 5 daily prayers, established a rhythm of remembrance that kept believers connected to Allah throughout their daily activities. Performed facing Mecca at dawn, midday, afternoon, sunset, and night, these prayers created a global community of worship that transcended all boundaries of nation, race, or social class. Zakat, the obligatory charitable giving, institutionalized economic justice by requiring those with wealth to share with the poor and needy. This wasn't mere charity, but a recognition that wealth was a trust from Allah to be used for the benefit of all society, creating one of history's earliest systematic approaches to poverty alleviation. Sawm, fasting during the month of Ramadan, developed spiritual discipline while fostering empathy for the hungry and needy. This month-long practice of abstaining from food, drink, and sexual relations during daylight hours became a time of intense spiritual reflection and community solidarity. Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, created a powerful symbol of Islamic unity as believers from every corner of the world gathered annually to perform the same rituals that connected them to Abraham, the father of monotheism. The sight of millions of pilgrims dressed in simple white garments, moving in harmony around the Kaaba, became one of the most powerful expressions of human equality and universal brotherhood ever created. In 630 CE, after years of conflict with his former persecutors, Muhammad returned to Mecca at the head of a massive army, but chose to enter the city peacefully rather than as a conqueror seeking revenge. His first act was to cleanse the Kaaba of its idols, declaring, "Truth has come and falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood is ever bound to vanish." This conquest of Mecca without bloodshed became a model for Islamic expansion, demonstrating that the new faith sought conversion of hearts rather than mere political domination. Many of Muhammad's former enemies converted to Islam and became some of its most dedicated champions, showing the transformative power of forgiveness and mercy. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, virtually the entire Arabian Peninsula had been united under the banner of Islam. Tribes that had feuded for centuries found common cause in their shared faith, creating a political unity that would serve as the foundation for one of history's most rapid territorial expansions. Throughout his 23-year prophetic mission, Muhammad continued to receive revelations that were carefully memorized by his companions and written down on whatever materials were available: palm fronds, stones, pieces of leather, or the shoulder blades of camels. These revelations, believed by Muslims to be the direct word of Allah transmitted through the angel Gabriel, were compiled into the Quran after Muhammad's death. The Quran's literary beauty and spiritual power were immediately recognized even by Muhammad's enemies, who accused him of sorcery because they could not explain how an illiterate merchant could produce such eloquent and moving poetry. Its rhythmic verses were perfectly suited for memorization and recitation, allowing the message to spread rapidly through an oral culture. More than just a religious text, the Quran became the foundation of Arabic literature and the primary source of Islamic law, theology, and spirituality. Its teachings on monotheism, social justice, personal morality, and the afterlife provided a comprehensive worldview that could address every aspect of human existence. The Quran's emphasis on knowledge and learning, quote, and say, "My Lord, increase me in knowledge," quote, would inspire the creation of one of history's greatest civilizations of learning, where Muslim scholars would preserve and advance human knowledge in fields ranging from mathematics and medicine to philosophy and poetry. After Muhammad's death, the Muslim community faced its first major crisis. Who would lead the rapidly expanding Islamic State? The solution was the institution of the Caliphate, with the Caliph serving as the Prophet's successor in political leadership, though not in his role as recipient of divine revelation. The first four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, were later honored as the righteous caliphs for their piety and dedication to Islamic principles. Under their leadership, Islam expanded beyond Arabia at a pace that astonished both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest companion and the first caliph, faced the immediate challenge of tribes that wanted to abandon Islam after the Prophet's death. His firm but just response established the principle that Islam was not merely a personal faith, but a complete social contract that could not be abandoned without consequence. Umar, the second caliph, oversaw the conquest of the Sassanid and Byzantine empires, bringing vast territories under Islamic rule. Yet he remained so humble and accessible that foreign dignitaries were astonished to find the ruler of half the known world sleeping under a palm tree, using his cloak as a pillow. Under Umar's leadership, the principles of Islamic governance were established: religious tolerance for people of the book, just treatment of conquered populations, and the use of existing administrative structures rather than wholesale replacement of local systems. This pragmatic approach allowed Islamic rule to be accepted and even welcomed by populations who had been oppressed by previous regimes. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by decades of warfare with Persia and theological disputes over the nature of Christ, proved unable to resist the Arab armies that emerged from the desert with their new faith and unified purpose. Syria fell to Muslim forces between 634 and 638 CE, with Damascus becoming an important center of Islamic civilization. The conquest of Jerusalem in 638 CE was particularly significant, as Caliph Umar personally traveled to the city to receive its surrender. His entry into Jerusalem, riding a simple camel and refusing to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, lest it be converted into a mosque, demonstrated the Islamic commitment to religious tolerance and respect for other faiths. Egypt, the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire, fell to Muslim armies led by Amr ibn al as in 641 CE. The ancient city of Alexandria, with its great library and tradition of learning, became a center for the translation of Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, beginning the process by which Islamic civilization would preserve and transmit classical knowledge to future generations. The Coptic Christians of Egypt, who had been persecuted by the Byzantine authorities for their theological beliefs, initially welcomed Muslim rule as a liberation from religious oppression. The jizya tax paid by non-Muslims was often lower than the taxes they had paid under Byzantine rule, and they were granted autonomy in their internal religious affairs. The Sassanid Empire of Persia, exhausted by centuries of warfare with Byzantium, collapsed even more dramatically than its western rival. At the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 CE, a Muslim army defeated a much larger Persian force, opening the way for the conquest of the entire Iranian plateau. The fall of Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, in 637 CE, brought enormous wealth into the Islamic treasury, including the famous carpet of Khosrow, woven with gold and precious stones. But more important than material wealth was the intellectual treasure of Persian civilization, including traditions of governance, poetry, and mystical spirituality that would profoundly influence Islamic culture. The Persian conversion to Islam was gradual but ultimately complete, and Persian Muslims became some of the most devoted and learned members of the Islamic community. The Persian language, written in Arabic script, became a major vehicle for Islamic literature and poetry, producing masterworks like Rumi's verses that continue to inspire seekers across religious boundaries. As Islamic rule expanded across diverse populations and cultures, the need arose for systematic legal and administrative frameworks based on Islamic principles. The foundations of Islamic law, Sharia, were established during this period, drawing from the Quran, the Hadith, sayings and actions of Prophet Muhammad, analogical reasoning, and scholarly consensus. Islamic law wasn't just a legal system, but a complete way of life that governed everything from personal hygiene and family relationships to commercial transactions and international relations. Its emphasis on justice, mercy, and the protection of the weak made it appealing to many who had suffered under previous legal systems that favored the wealthy and powerful. The institution of the Qadi, judge, was established to administer justice according to Islamic principles, with courts that were accessible to all regardless of social status. The requirement that legal proceedings be conducted in Arabic led to the rapid spread of the Arabic language across the Islamic world, creating a common medium of communication that facilitated trade, scholarship, and cultural exchange. Islamic commercial law, based on Quranic principles of honesty and fairness, helped facilitate the growth of trade networks that would eventually span from Spain to Southeast Asia. The prohibition of interest riba led to the development of innovative financial instruments like profit-sharing partnerships and investment certificates that avoided exploitation while enabling economic growth. One of Islam's most remarkable achievements during this early period was its ability to create a unified civilization from incredibly diverse cultural elements. Arab, Persian, Byzantine, and Indian traditions were synthesized into a distinctively Islamic culture that maintained unity in diversity. The Arabic language became the lingua franca of the Islamic world, but rather than suppressing local languages, it enriched them. Persian poetry, Turkish literature, and African oral traditions all flourished under Islamic patronage, creating a multicultural civilization that was both cosmopolitan and authentically Islamic. Islamic art and architecture began to develop their distinctive characteristics during this period, with the prohibition on representational imagery leading to the development of magnificent geometric patterns and calligraphy that seemed to point beyond the physical world to divine transcendence. The first great mosques, like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the Great Mosque of Damascus, established architectural principles that would influence Islamic building for centuries. By 700 CE, Islam had established itself as a major world civilization, ruling territories from Spain to Central Asia and commanding the allegiance of millions of believers. But more than territorial conquest, Islam had achieved something remarkable: the creation of a global community united by faith rather than ethnicity or nationality. The seeds were already planted for the great flowering of Islamic civilization that would occur in the following centuries. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad would become a center of learning that preserved and advanced human knowledge. Islamic scholars would make crucial contributions to mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and science, and Islamic mysticism would produce some of history's greatest spiritual poetry and teachings. The rapid expansion of Islam in its first century demonstrated the power of a message that spoke to humanity's deepest needs: the need for meaning and purpose, for justice and equality, for connection to the divine, and to a community of faith. Like the other great religions we have encountered in our nocturnal journey, Islam offered not just beliefs to be accepted, but a complete way of life to be lived, a path that promised transformation both in this world and the next. As we prepare to conclude our gentle voyage through the dawn of the world's great faiths, the call to prayer echoes across the desert night, as it has for nearly 14 centuries, reminding believers that Allah is great, that Muhammad is his messenger, and that success comes through submission to the divine will that governs all existence. In this call lies the essence of Islam: surrender to the one who created all things, care for the community of believers, and the promise that this life is but a preparation for the eternal life to come. As our peaceful journey through the rise of the world's great religions draws toward its gentle conclusion, we find ourselves at a moment of profound reflection. From 0 to 700 CE, 4 mighty rivers of faith flowed across the ancient world, each carving its own channel through human consciousness, yet all part of a greater watershed of spiritual awakening that transformed civilization itself. In the soft twilight of historical imagination, let us step back and observe the magnificent tapestry that these faiths wove together during these 7 pivotal centuries. Christianity, spreading from a small Palestinian province to become the religion of the Roman Empire. Hinduism, crystallizing its eternal wisdom into forms that would endure for millennia. Buddhism, carrying its message of liberation across the vast expanse of Asia. And Islam, emerging in the Arabian desert to unite diverse peoples under the banner of divine unity. These were not isolated phenomena, but interconnected streams of human spiritual evolution, each responding to the deep hunger for meaning, purpose, and transcendence that characterizes our species at its finest. Though they arose in different times and places, spoke different languages and employed different symbols, they all addressed the same fundamental questions. Who are we? Why do we suffer? How should we live? What lies beyond death? Despite their differences in doctrine and practice, these 4 great traditions shared remarkable commonalities that reveal something profound about the human spiritual quest. Each arose during periods of social upheaval and moral confusion, offering hope and direction to people who felt lost in changing times. Each proclaimed that ultimate reality transcended the material world while remaining intimately involved in human affairs. All 4 traditions emphasized the fundamental dignity and spiritual potential of every human being, regardless of social status, ethnicity, or gender. Christianity proclaimed that all were equal in the eyes of God. Hinduism taught that the divine self dwelt within every creature. Buddhism revealed that all beings possessed Buddha, nature. Islam declared that the most honored in Allah's sight were the most righteous, not the most privileged. Each tradition developed sophisticated understandings of ethics and morality that went far beyond mere rule, following to encompass the cultivation of virtue, compassion, and wisdom. The Christian emphasis on love of God and neighbor, the Hindu concept of Dharma as righteous living, the Buddhist Noble Eightfold Path, and the Islamic concept of taqwa or God consciousness all pointed toward the transformation of human character as the foundation of spiritual life. All four religions developed rich traditions of mystical experience and contemplative practice, recognizing that intellectual understanding alone was insufficient for spiritual transformation. Christian desert fathers, Hindu yogis, Buddhist meditators, and Islamic Sufis all discovered that direct experience of the divine required dedicated practice, purification of the heart, and surrender of the ego's claims to ultimate importance. Perhaps most remarkably, each tradition developed what we might call technologies of transformation, specific practices and methods designed to facilitate spiritual development and direct encounter with ultimate reality. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated systems based on careful observation of consciousness and refined through centuries of experimentation by countless practitioners. Christianity developed the practices of prayer, contemplation, and sacramental worship that created opportunities for divine grace to transform human nature. The Jesus Prayer, Lectio Divina, and Eucharistic devotion became pathways for believers to experience the living presence of Christ within their own hearts and minds. Hinduism perfected the science of yoga, not merely physical exercises, but comprehensive methods for uniting individual consciousness with universal consciousness. Whether through the bhakti yoga of devotional love, the karma yoga of selfless action, the raja yoga of meditation, or the jnana yoga of wisdom, Hinduism offered paths suited to every temperament and level of spiritual development. Buddhism created perhaps the most systematic approaches to meditation and mental cultivation, with precise instructions for developing concentration, mindfulness, and insight. The methodical investigation of mental and physical phenomena led to direct realization of the impermanent, interdependent nature of existence and the possibility of liberation from suffering. Islam developed the practice of dhikr, the remembrance of Allah, which could range from simple repetition of divine names to sophisticated breathing techniques and spiritual exercises that opened the heart to direct divine experience. The 5 daily prayers created a rhythm of spiritual practice that kept believers constantly aware of their relationship with the divine. Beyond their individual spiritual teachings, these 4 religions collectively initiated one of history's greatest social revolutions, challenging existing hierarchies and power structures while promoting ideals of justice, compassion, and universal human dignity. This wasn't always a smooth or immediate process, but over time, the influence of these faiths fundamentally altered how societies understood human relationships and social responsibility. Christianity's early emphasis on the equality of all believers, regardless of social status, gradually undermined the rigid class structures of the Roman Empire. The Christian teaching that earthly power was temporary and that ultimate authority belonged to God alone provided a religious foundation for limiting the absolute power of rulers and protecting the rights of the powerless. Hinduism's concept of Dharma, with its emphasis on the duties and responsibilities appropriate to each stage of life, created frameworks for social organization that balanced individual freedom with collective welfare. The idea that actions in this life determined one's circumstances in future lives encouraged ethical behavior and provided hope for eventual spiritual advancement regardless of current circumstances. Buddhism's rejection of the caste system and its teaching that spiritual attainment depended on personal effort rather than birth or social status challenged hierarchical assumptions throughout Asian societies. The Buddhist Sangha, with its democratic decision-making processes and emphasis on merit rather than heredity, provided alternative models of social organization. Islam's radical egalitarianism, symbolized by the Hajj pilgrimage, where all participants wore identical simple garments, directly challenged tribal and racial hierarchies. The Islamic emphasis on justice and the protection of the weak led to legal and social innovations that improved the status of women, slaves, and minorities in many contexts. These four religious traditions also became the primary vehicles for preserving, transmitting, and advancing human knowledge during the period from 0 to 700 CE. As the classical civilizations of Greece, Rome, and Persia declined or transformed, religious institutions often became the custodians of learning and culture. Christian monasteries preserved classical texts through the Dark Ages of European history, while Christian scholars like Augustine integrated Greek philosophy with Christian theology, creating intellectual frameworks that would dominate Western thought for over 1,000 years. The great cathedral schools and universities that would later emerge from Christian culture had their roots in the scholarly traditions established during this early period. Hindu temples and ashrams became centers of learning where mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were studied alongside religious texts. The concept of zero decimal notation and advanced mathematical techniques developed by Hindu scholars would eventually revolutionize human understanding of number and calculation. Buddhist monasteries, particularly the great universities of Nalanda and Taxila in India, attracted scholars from across Asia and became international centers of learning where knowledge was shared across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Buddhist scholars made crucial contributions to logic, psychology, and philosophy that influenced intellectual development throughout the Buddhist world. Islamic scholars, building on the foundations laid during the religion's first century, would soon create the House of Wisdom in Baghdad and similar institutions that preserved Greek philosophy and science while making original contributions that advanced human knowledge in fields ranging from medicine and mathematics to astronomy and chemistry. The Islamic emphasis on learning as a religious duty created a culture of scholarship that would influence global intellectual development. The rise of these four great religions also catalyzed extraordinary developments in art, architecture, literature, and music that continue to inspire and move people today. Religious devotion became the driving force behind some of humanity's greatest cultural achievements, as believers sought to create beauty worthy of their divine inspirations. Christian art, beginning with simple symbols in the catacombs of Rome, evolved into the magnificent basilicas of Byzantium and the soaring Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe. Christian liturgical music, from Gregorian chant to the elaborate polyphony of later periods, created new forms of musical expression that elevated the human spirit toward divine contemplation. Hindu temple architecture reached extraordinary heights of sophistication and beauty, with structures like the temples of Khajuraho and Konark representing the universe in stone, while serving as functional centers of worship and community life. Hindu literature, from the great epics to the intimate poetry of the Bhakti saints, explored every aspect of human experience in relationship to the divine. Buddhist art, from the serene statues of the Buddha to the intricate mandalas of Tibetan Buddhism, created visual representations of spiritual states and cosmic principles that served both as objects of devotion and as aids to meditation. The great Buddhist stupas and pagodas that arose across Asia became focal points for community life and spiritual practice. Islamic art, with its emphasis on geometric patterns and calligraphy rather than representational imagery, developed unique aesthetic principles that suggested the infinite complexity and beauty of divine creation. Islamic architecture, from the Dome of the Rock to the great mosques of Damascus and Cordoba, created spaces that facilitated both communal worship and individual contemplation. As these four religions grew from small communities of believers into major civilizational forces, they faced new challenges that tested their spiritual authenticity and practical wisdom. Success brought wealth, political power, and social influence, but also the temptations of corruption, compromise, and the gradual replacement of spiritual priorities with institutional concerns. 2.0 Christianity's transformation from a persecuted minority to the official religion of the Roman Empire forced difficult questions about the relationship between spiritual and temporal power. The development of ecclesiastical hierarchies, theological orthodoxy, and institutional authority sometimes conflicted with Christianity's original emphasis on simplicity, humility, and direct personal relationship with God. Hinduism's integration into existing social structures helped ensure its survival and growth. but also led to the hardening of caste distinctions and ritualistic practices that sometimes obscured the tradition's deeper spiritual insights. The challenge of maintaining authentic spirituality within complex social and political systems became an ongoing concern for Hindu reformers and spiritual teachers. Buddhism's spread across diverse cultures led to significant variations in practice and understanding that sometimes seemed to contradict the Buddha's original teachings. The development of elaborate cosmologies, devotional practices centered on celestial Buddhas, and institutional monasticism raised questions about fidelity to the historical Buddha's message of individual liberation through understanding. Islam's rapid expansion and political success created tensions between the ideal of the Ummah, community of believers, and the practical realities of governing diverse populations with different languages, customs, and religious backgrounds. The development of Islamic law, theology, and political theory required constant balancing between revealed principles and practical necessities. Yet, despite these challenges, the fundamental insights and aspirations that gave birth to these four great traditions continued to inspire and transform human consciousness throughout this formative period. The questions they raised and the answers they offered remained relevant not just to their own adherents, but to all humanity's ongoing quest for meaning and transcendence. How do we live meaningful lives in the face of suffering and death? Christianity answered with the promise of resurrection and eternal life through divine love. Hinduism with the teaching of eternal souls progressing through multiple lifetimes toward ultimate liberation. Buddhism with the possibility of nirvana achieved through understanding the nature of existence. Islam with submission to Allah's will and the promise of paradise for the righteous. How do we create just and compassionate societies? Each tradition offered practical guidance and inspiring ideals, Christian love and service to the poor and marginalized, Hindu Dharma with its vision of social harmony based on duty and righteousness, Buddhist compassion, and the ideal of the Bodhisattva who works for all beings' liberation, Islamic justice, and the creation of communities based on divine guidance rather than human prejudice. How do we experience the sacred in our daily lives? All four traditions developed rich devotional practices, contemplative techniques, and ethical guidelines that transformed ordinary activities into opportunities for spiritual growth and divine encounter. Whether through Christian prayer and sacrament, Hindu puja and yoga, Buddhist meditation and mindfulness, or Islamic dhikr and submission, believers found pathways to experience ultimate reality within the context of their daily lives. By 700 CE, these four great religious traditions had established the fundamental patterns and institutions that would continue to shape human civilization for centuries to come. They had created libraries and schools, hospitals and charitable institutions, legal systems, and forms of governance, artistic traditions, and philosophical schools that would preserve and advance human knowledge and welfare. More importantly, they had demonstrated that human beings were capable of organizing their lives around higher purposes than mere survival, pleasure, or power. They showed that ordinary people could experience profound transformation through spiritual practice, that communities could be built on principles of love and justice rather than fear and domination, and that individual liberation and collective welfare were not opposing goals, but complementary aspects of authentic human flourishing. The missionary activities of these religions had created the first truly global networks of communication and cultural exchange. Christian monasteries, Hindu pilgrimage routes, Buddhist monasteries along the Silk Road, and Islamic trade networks created connections that transcended political boundaries and facilitated the sharing of ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations across vast distances. As we reach the end of our gentle nighttime voyage through the rise of the world's great religions, we can see that the story we have traced is not one of completion, but of beginning. The period from 0 to 700 CE laid the foundations for developments that would continue to unfold throughout human history, as each tradition continued to evolve, adapt, and respond to new challenges and opportunities. The interfaith encounters that began during this period, Christians meeting Buddhists along the Silk Road, Hindu and Islamic scholars debating in medieval universities, Jewish communities finding homes within Christian and Islamic civilizations, would continue to enrich all traditions through mutual challenge and inspiration. The recognition that divine truth might manifest in multiple forms while remaining essentially one would become an increasingly important insight as human consciousness continued to evolve. The scientific and philosophical insights preserved and developed within these religious traditions would eventually contribute to the great flowering of human knowledge that we call the modern world. The ethical principles and social ideals they promoted would inspire movements for justice, freedom, and human dignity that continue to shape our contemporary world. Most importantly, the spiritual practices and insights they developed remain as relevant and transformative today as they were 14 centuries ago. The human need for meaning, purpose, and transcendence that gave birth to these traditions continues to call forth new expressions of ancient wisdom, new applications of eternal truths to contemporary challenges. In the deepest sense, the story we have shared in these quiet hours is not just about the past, but about the eternal present in which all authentic spiritual seeking takes place. The Christ consciousness that transformed the ancient world continues to work in human hearts today. The eternal Dharma that the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree remains available to all who seek liberation. The divine self that Hindu sages discovered in meditation still dwells within every being. The Allah to whom Muhammad submitted continues to call humanity towards surrender and peace. As you drift towards sleep, carried by these gentle currents of sacred history, remember that you are part of this great stream of human spiritual evolution. The same divine mystery that inspired prophets and sages, saints and bodhisattvas continues to work within your own heart, seeking expression through your unique gifts and circumstances. The great religions arose not as final answers to human questions, but as invitations to participate in the ongoing creation of a more compassionate, just, and enlightened world. Their founders and early followers were ordinary human beings like yourself, who discovered that life could be lived at depths of meaning and purpose they had never imagined possible. Their legacy is not a museum of ancient artifacts, but a living stream of wisdom and inspiration that continues to flow through time, nourishing all who drink from its waters. And so our journey through the dawn of faith comes to its gentle end, as all journeys must, in the place where we began, in the eternal present where the divine and human meet, where ancient wisdom and contemporary seeking converge, where the questions of the heart find their deepest answers, not in words, but in the silence that embraces all words. Rest now in the peace that passes understanding, the peace that was proclaimed by angels over Bethlehem, discovered by the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, celebrated in the devotional songs of Hindu saints, and found by Muhammad in the cave of Hira. This peace is not separate from you, but is your own deepest nature, temporarily obscured by the activities of daily life, but always available to those who seek it with sincere hearts. May the wisdom of all traditions illuminate your dreams. May their compassion embrace your sorrows. May their joy uplift your spirit, and may their peace carry you safely through the night toward the dawn of a new day filled with infinite possibility. For in the end, this is what all the great religions promise, that each new day is an opportunity to begin again, to love more deeply, to serve more faithfully, and to open more completely to the sacred mystery that is the source and goal of all existence. Sleep well, dear fellow traveler on the path of awakening. The light that began to shine in those first 7 centuries of the Common Era continues to shine, and it shines most brightly in hearts like yours that remain open to wonder, to love, and to the possibility that life's deepest questions have answers that can be lived even when they cannot be fully understood.